Hello, welcome back to Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. We have been doing a structuralism series over the past 10 lectures, and I've been digging most recently into Mikhail Bakhtin's dialogic imagination. We are on Forms of Time and Chronotope in the novel, one of the longer essays in the book. And this is going to be part two. So if you can see this, there's a previous lecture to this, multiple lectures. In my last lecture, besides dealing with the introduction to this essay, I also was applying a bit to Jesmyn Ward's recent novel, Seeing Unburied Seeing. I'm going to step away from that sort of context in this particular section of the essay, but I will try to make connections to various different famous books or movements in theory in the 20th century or in literature in the 20th and 21st centuries. Bakhtin, as I said, was responding very much to scientific discoveries. And so again, this is like part of what, my motivations for having a theory of a Center for Critical and Cultural Theory is that, these really dumb divides between the sciences and literature that have characterized so much of public school curriculum and the ways that we emphasize in the United States STEM over the humanities or something. What we see is that there's actually like much more of a dialogue actually going on between literature and emergent science, and it doesn't have to be only in science fiction, for example, for that to take place. This essay is on the idea of the chronotope, which is kind of Bakhtin's answer to Einstein, right? To ideas of space-time. What we also see, and I think what you would sort of encounter in general introductions to literature or long survey classes in European literature, is this arc towards internality, right? And that came up in earlier lectures, as well as I was talking about the big high modernism, as it's called in literature or literary studies, in the early 20th century, and writers like James Joyce, Marcel Proust, for example, are dealing with internal consciousness, just like in painting, right? Expressivist painting was dealing with, like Edvard Munch or someone like that is dealing with expressing outwardly some sort of contours of interiority. And we can think about abstraction and Vasily Kandinsky, for example, in painting as well. And I think that that's a good way to think about someone like Bakhtin, is that he really is approaching literature as a fine art, and not necessarily separate from visual art, for example. In fact, drawing heavily on those traditions. When we think about this part two, where he's dealing with Apuleius and Petronius, he's dealing with Petronius's novel Satyricon and Apuleius. And what I want to sort of emphasize, because I think that probably most of my students, most of my viewers have probably not read those novels, and it's not to say that they're not worth reading and looking at a closer analysis, but my goal here is part of this broader series on structuralism, and looking at Bakhtin's take and looking at the way that Bakhtin was received in the United States as a literary theorist, even though these essays were written during the late 1930s or definitely earlier in the 20th century. So why does Bakhtin find so much fertile soil to arrive in the United States in that kind of post-structuralist situation? And my argument has been that an understanding of like the arc of structuralism as a broader discourse, which includes post-structuralism, shows why that might be the case. So when he's looking at Apuleius, at the Golden Ass, which is Apuleius's novel, if I kind of encapsulate this lecture in brief words in the beginning, he's moving from adventure time, which we talked about in the last lecture, to some more kind of interior time, and that's the pattern I want you to notice, because it's a pattern towards interiority that happens throughout European culture that we oftentimes think of with, say, the Protestant Reformation in the early 1500s, that there's a move towards internal conscience, and that with that move towards interiority, there becomes a personal relationship with the divine, right? So that theological gesture that has so much of a parallel to so many other cultural developments throughout Europe in the 16th century. We could look at René Descartes, like I think, therefore I am, skeptical philosophy. Again, it's that interior move. And if this was a philosophy class, we would talk about like the subjective turn, that turn towards interiority. And in intro to literature classes, this is oftentimes like how people deal with talking about the ancient world versus modernity. And we're talking about modernity the past 500 years. We're not talking about your latest iPhone update, right? When we're talking about modernity. But what makes Bakhtin interesting in that context, I think, is that he is looking at shifts towards interiority that happen in the ancient world, and that happen around the birth of what later becomes the influential movement in Europe, Christianity, right? So he's not talking about what I call Euro Christianity, right? Because that's a later development after the Roman Catholic Church and develops in Rome, of course, in Italy, which is in Europe. But of course, Christianity doesn't start there. And so I think when we look at section 2 of this essay, we have to think a little bit about some of the religious and cultural contexts that are going on around the time of poets like Ovid, around the time of these Latin writers, right, like Apuleius. But to jump into the text here, he's going to move us in this chapter, or this section of his essay, from Apuleius to Petronius. And his point is that we're moving from adventure time to something more like everyday time. It's a parallel gesture that he will do in earlier essays in this book between sort of heroic time or epic time and the novel itself. He's giving us a more nuanced approach, you might say, in this particular section of the essay. So he begins with the Golden Ass, which is a novel by Apuleius, and he says, "Let us now pass to the second type of the ancient novel, which we will provisionally call the adventure novel of everyday life. In a strict sense, only two works belong to this category: the Satyricon of Petronius, which has come down to us in comparatively few fragments, and the Golden Ass of Apuleius, which has survived in its entirety. But the characteristic features of this type occur in other genres as well, primarily in satires in the Hellenistic diatribe, as well as the several works from early Christian literature on the lives of saints, or hagiography, right? A sinful life filled with temptation, followed by the crisis and rebirth. And that is what I mean, is that what Bakhtin is saying is notable about this shift to everydayness in these particular novels is it also has this kind of interior shift that we're going to associate with the new religious movements of the ancient world. And in that sense, Christianity at this particular time is one of those movements. Now, Christianity, of course, becomes something else much bigger later on, but what we're able to see in this particular essay is the way that Christianity is drawing from various different cultural influences, both Greek and Judaic, in its birth, and then of course Latin as well, right, as it becomes Romanized. So he's talking about the Golden Ass, which we have in its entirety, and he says the basic plot of the novel, is the life story of Lucius, and it's presented as the course of a life sheathed in a metamorphosis, as is also the case in the inserted novella about Cupid and Psyche, which turns out to be a parallel semantic variant of the basic plot. The themes of metamorphosis or transformation, particularly human transformation, and identity, particularly human identity, are drawn from the treasury of pre-classic world folklore. The folkloric image of man is intimately bound up with the transformation and identity. This combination may be seen with particular clarity in the popular folk tale. And of course, this has been like Bakhtin is very much interested in the kind of reservoir of folk knowledge from which novelists pull stories, narrative development, right? The folktale image of man throughout the extraordinary variety of folkloric narratives always orders itself around motifs of transformation and identity. No matter how varied in its turn the concrete expression of these motifs might be. The motifs of transformation and identity, which began as matters of concern for individual, are transferred to the entire human world and to nature and those things that man himself has created. We will discuss later those distinct features of popular folktale time where this transformation identity motif is revealed in the image of man and its connection with Rabelais. We've mentioned that briefly in other lectures, right? And this becomes Bakhtin's magnum opus, like his great work is on Rabelais and the Renaissance and the reversals of ceremony, reversals of kingship, right? And he has said this over and over again, that this is the context of novelistic language is about a kind of reversing of the epic, of the nobility towards the commoner, when the jester becomes the king for a day in Carnival, right? So that's what that is what drives Bakhtin, is this idea of folkish culture, but also festivity, and how we move from that type of temporality towards this more Christian and secularized type of time. Because remember, the term secular is actually a Christian term for temporality, and it has a kind of linear temporality built into it. So I know very well that, like, outside of these lectures, that people might use secular as opposed to religious, but that dyad between secular and religion is actually it comes from Christianity itself. And the priests who took care, or the priests who took care of the secular laity, the lay people, are the people who, held masses. And the other part of the church were the ascetics, or the monks, who were separate from society, right? And had devoted their entire lives to the temporality of heaven or God or the city of God, things like that. So that kind of division comes from thinkers like Saint Augustine, between city of God, city of man, right? So that is really, really important to my own thinking and the ways that I teach, and also for understanding a lot of theory related stuff when we're talking about religion, because secular isn't anti-religious in any sort of sense in the way that I'm talking about it here. It has to do with a different notion of temporality in the world, and something like an indigenous perspective that's not going to have religion, which is kind of the Euro-Christian concept to begin with. That's going to be a completely different worldview and temporality. And we can look at writers like Tink Tinker, the Osage or Washage writer, who has written about worldview in that particular way. So very, very clear distinction there. What I think that Bakhtin is getting at with this there's in the ancient world, there's a popular use of metamorphosis. And you can think of a poet like Ovid and how famous his Metamorphoses are. If you've ever read them, it's kind of like he's showing what an amazing poet he is by being able to take stories from every kind of tradition, like whether it's like Genesis in the Hebraic tradition, we see flood stuff going on, and he's able to show transformation after transformation after transformation, which shows both his knowledge, but really his rhetorical use of transformation is what's showing his eloquence and his ability as a writer, in the same way that I think that someone like Apuleius does as well. And what we see with that, what I think Bakhtin is going for in this particular chapter, is that the way that emphasis on metamorphosis, even though it's externalized in terms of like someone turning into a golden ass, for example, that transformation allows somebody to sort of step out of their sphere, and look at the world in a particular way. And then when they transform back, they've become a new type of person, right? So there's a structure in this process of transformation that becomes internalized, and that the Christians come to make a big use of in their genres of particularly the lives of the saints. On page 112 here, he says, in ancient times, the idea of metamorphosis underwent an extremely complex and multi-branched path of development. One of the branches on this path is Greek philosophy, where the idea of transformation, along with that of identity, plays an enormous role. In fact, the central mythological sheath of these ideas is retained as late as Democritus and Aristophanes, and even did not succeed in casting it off completely. And so we might think of, like, for example, in Plato's Republic, for example, we see the tale of Gyges and the ring, right? If you know the Lord of the Rings stories, and Bilbo Baggins finds the ring, or Frodo Baggins inherits the ring that allows him to turn invisible, that idea is, pulled, J.R.R. Tolkien pulls it right out of Plato, in the Republic, and the ethical ideas that are associated with what happens when one can become invisible, right? With the ring, that the ring becomes a kind of device that changes, that gives transformation, right? And then the Hobbit as a character for Tolkien, who's the halfling, like the not human and not orc or whatever, not dwarf, right? Like that allows a kind of stepping outside, so that we can have a sort of commentary on human existence as well, or Middle Earth, as he pulls from Anglo-Saxon literature. So the metamorphosis itself is a kind of chronotope, right? Like it can operate as a chronotope, because it operates as a change in time, or a periodic, like, change. Like, I've changed into an ass for a while, and now I've changed back, in Apuleius's case. So he goes on here, he says, another branch will be the cultic development of the idea of the metamorphosis, or the transformation, in the ancient mysteries, especially the Eleusinian mysteries. So again, to go back to Plato and to Socrates, who's oftentimes referring to the Eleusinian mysteries and what happens when one has been initiated into the mysteries themselves. Now that becomes a heavy ritualized influence on Christianity as it develops later on. But we see these earlier ideas and embryonic ideas, I think, maybe showing up in Greek philosophy as well. And then once you get like a theologian like St. Augustine, who's Platonic to begin with, we get a whole bunch of an importation of Greek modes of thinking about things. So the Eleusinian mysteries show up here. He says, in the later stages of their development, these ancient mysteries increasingly succumbed to the influence of Oriental cults, which had their own specific forms of metamorphosis. The original forms of the Christian cult would be included in this line of development. We should also add to this group those crude magical forms of metamorphosis that were exceedingly widespread in the 1st and 2nd century AD, forms that were practiced by charlatans of various sorts and occupied a permanent place in the everyday life of the era. Maybe if you're not into religious history or anything, you can think about the Monty Python's Life of Brian, right? And it opens up with all of the different kind of prophets so spieling their own doctrine, and then Brian gets listened to, right? He says a third branch of this metamorphosis tendency would be the continuing presence of transformation motifs in purely popular folklore. This folklore has not, of course, come down to us in its pure form, but we know of its existence through the influence it exercised, its reflection in literature, for example, in Apuleius' novella about Cupid and Psyche. Finally, he says there's one other branch here, and that's the development of the idea of the metamorphosis in literature proper. Only this branch concerns us in the present context. So there are other ways that we could look at the theme or the motif of metamorphosis showing up, but he wants to focus on literature proper. He wants to focus not on oral storytelling or folklore, but on the way that it's the work that it is doing in these particular novel forms from Apuleius and Petronius. Over on page 113 here, he says that if we look at the history of this sort of stuff, it goes back to Hesiod, right? The theogony and works of days, ancient Greek literature. And he says, if we looked closely at the ways that Hesiod, in both works and days and theogony took this complex mythological theme, and with great artistry broke it down into a variety of sequences, we observe the following: a specific genealogical series unfolding, a distinctive sequence of shifts in ages and generations, the myth of the 5 ages, like the golden, the silver, the bronze, the Trojan, or heroic and iron, an irreversible theogonic sequence of metamorphosis in nature, including the cyclical series of metamorphosis for grain and an analogical series of metamorphosis in the vine and the grape. What is more, for Hesiod, even the cyclical sequence of everyday agricultural labor is structured in its own way, like a metamorphosis of the farmer, which, with all of the above, we are still far from exhausting the temporal sequences Hesiod generated that use the idea of metamorphosis as their mythological etiology. All these series have in common the fact of sequentiality, items that follow upon one another, but a sequentiality whose units assume extremely varied forms or images, forms utterly different from one another. Thus, in the theogonic process of the era of Zeus replaces the era of Chronos. As the ages change from gold to silver, for example, so do the generations of men, while in other series, it is the seasons that replace each other. Now, sometimes I think people will, in a more basic way, try and say like, oh, well, yes, we have a kind of linear temporality, a linear view of modernity as it progresses, and we're going to associate that with modernity versus the ancient cyclical seasonal relationship to time. And I think that that's useful up to a certain extent, but what I think Bakhtin is getting at is that within this tradition that of metamorphosis, we get all of that sort of mixed together. It's not one or the other, seasonal time, or the ways when I was an undergraduate in college, we look at the goddess Fortuna, a pagan Roman goddess, the wheel of fortune, right? Shifting the wheels. And that's where we get like the king on the top and the fool on the bottom, and fortune's wheel moves and rotates. And that's the force of fortune coming throughout human life, and it sometimes is characterized as having a divine plan, like providence, capital P, with the Christians, and sometimes in the pagan sense it's just force, like the force of nature itself. And we still have terminology like the force of nature. I brought up Chuke, or luck, the goddess of luck, in my earlier lecture as well. And so yes, we get later on these philosophical discourses on the idea of free will versus determinism and stuff, but even to have that dyad, both ideas sort of need to come in. And so I don't want to just characterize, say, Christianity as having only a temporality that is linear and progressive. That is part of it, because they have this idea of a second coming. They've imposed a kind of calendar or a sense of time. They restart time, right? That's why, like, for most of us in the West today, we use dates that go back to Christianity, even whether or not we call ourselves Christians. We live in a Euro-Christian structure of temporality and measurement of time, which is quite different than, say, the Mayan calendar, for example, or the Jewish liturgical calendar, for when New Year starts, or the Chinese New Year, right? That we know that different communities in the world still exist that have different notions of when a new year starts, but the dominant form is still, at least in my context, the Euro-Christian form right now. And so we get within the yearly sequence or liturgy of Christian time, yes, that you still have the seasons, the ancient culture of the changing of seasons with Easter and the different holidays that happen, but they are encapsulated within this year, and then this year, and then this year, and then this year, right? That sequential moment of time. Coming back to Bakhtin here, he does shift over to discuss Ovid and Ovid's Metamorphoses, which are quite probably, I think, more well known than Apuleius's Golden Ass. This is on 114. He says Ovid's Metamorphosis is typical in this later stage. The general idea of metamorphosis has already become the private metamorphosis of the individual. Isolated beings is already acquiring individual isolated beings, and is already acquiring the characteristic of an external miraculous transformation. So the more that we move towards an individual, an exceptional individual, we also see that mirrored in some sort of externalized transformation as well. Now you think about someone like Ovid writing like really near around the same time that the Christ figure is coming into being. Of course, different parts of the world, right? Or at least of the Mediterranean world, between Italy and Israel, what we call Israel or Palestine today. So lots of different multicultural influence going on, but the broader, what Bakhtin is saying is that there's the shift, the more that we shift towards the individual or focus on the individual hero, the isolated individual, the more that we get an image of an externalized transformation. And this then becomes parallel with, of course, the lives of saints, right? So over on page 115, he says that what happens is there's a kind of crisis, right? And of course, in philosophy, like crisis, like in Greek, like we get judgment, right? Crisis, like, but we also see that this is something has happened that starts the journey of the transformation here. He says, metamorphosis serves as the basis for a method of portraying the whole of an individual's life in its more important moments of crisis, for showing how an individual becomes other than what he was. We are offered various sharply differing images of one and of the same individual, images that are united in him as various epochs and stages in the course of his life. There is no evolution in the strict sense of the word. What we get rather is crisis and rebirth, crisis and rebirth. This is what essentially distinguishes the Apuleian plot from the plots of the Greek romance. The events that Apuleius describes determine the life of the hero. They define his entire life. Now, remember, maybe from earlier lectures, we have like the 19th century Bildungsroman novel, the experience novel. And that's in recent memory for someone like Bakhtin as a writer. But what he's doing is saying, like, we already have this kind of move back in the ancient world towards this way of using time and temporality through the chronotope to set the parameters or the boundaries of the protagonist's life. And that's what happens in the Golden S. He says, in the crisis type of portrayal, we see only one or two moments that decide the fate of a man's life and determine its entire disposition. In keeping with this principle, the novel provides us with 2 or 3 different images of the same individual, images that have been disjoined and rejoined through the crisis and rebirths. In the major plot, Apuleius presents 3 images: Lucius before he's transformed into an ass, Lucius as the ass, and then Lucius mysteriously purified and renewed. In the parallel plot, we have only 2 images of Psyche, before she's purified by redemptive suffering, and then after. But here, the progression of the heroine's rebirth is not broken down into 3 sharply differentiated images of her, as in the case of Lucius. Now, he shifts over to talk about Christian literature and crisis, or hagiographies, the lives of saints, right? In early Christian crisis hagiographies belonging to this type, we also have, as a rule, only 2 images of an individual, images that are separated and reunited through the crisis and rebirth. The image of the sinner before rebirth and the image of the holy man or the saint after. 3 image sequences are something met with, especially where there is a particular emphasis on the development of that portion of the saint's life devoted toward ascesis. And of course, that term, we get the term ascetic, right? Like a monk, the turning away from society, or an inward turn is often the ways that it is characterized. But we can think of the desert fathers, people going out into the desert to purify themselves as well. So it has to do with a kind of disciplining of the self. Now, remember, again, this is like a broader series on structuralism, and the post-structuralists like Michel Foucault are obsessed with entire histories of ascesis, right? Writing in the 1970s. And again, I just want to emphasize that like Bakhtin has already done this, like well before Michel Foucault is writing his history of sexuality, birth of biopolitics, all I mean, great lectures, right? That Michel Foucault puts together at the College of France. But like, I mean, give Bakhtin some credit here as well, right? Because this is really, really rich stuff. He says, from what has been said, it should be clear that the novel of this type does not, strictly speaking, unfold in biographical time. It depicts only the exceptional, utterly unusual moments of a man's life, moments that are very short compared to the length of the man's life. But these moments shape the definitive image of the man, his essence, as well as the nature of his entire subsequent life. But the further course of that life, with its biographical pace, its activities and labors, stretches out after the rebirth, and consequently already lies beyond the realm of the novel. Thus, Lucius, having passed through 3 initiations, enters upon his biographical life as a rhetorician and a priest. He's emphasizing on these particular moments. It's like I mean, a way to think of this, like to like bring it into a very mundane situation. It's like, imagine like you're like watching Star Wars, and like there's like lightsabers and stuff fighting, and then like, you know, Han Solo is just like, oh, I gotta go take a shit. like the breaking in of like the most mundane things are like, now on tattooing, like it's just people sitting around not doing anything, like Princess Leia's reading a book for a while. It's like that's not what we normally see in story development. And so because of that, there becomes this emphasis on the teaching elements, and the rhetorical act of telling the story. He says these then are the constitutive or constitutive features of adventure time of the second type. It is not the time of a Greek romance, a time that leaves no traces. On the contrary, it leaves a deep and ineradicable mark on the man himself, as well as onto the entire context. It is, nevertheless, decidedly adventure time, a time of exceptional transformation, right, that occurs. But what we're seeing more and more is this shift towards like the character, the development of the character eventually will come from this, and the didactic or teaching elements, the rhetorical elements that come with the character. Later down on the same page of 116, he himself is guilty. There's a kind of purity development going on. So we see guilt showing up as the cause for why the transformation has occurred, right? So we're starting, and first we emphasize that the transformation has happened, this exceptional thing, and now we're saying, well, why did it happen to this particular person, and what do they go through to get out of it? Do they develop? Do they become dynamic, right? So if it's literature 101 class, we often talk about stock characters in stories that don't change, they don't develop, versus dynamic characters that change over time. There's also with that a kind of shift towards internality, that we don't see very much of the internal conscience of someone like Oedipus the king, although he might be a marker for as one of those shifts towards internality. And a lot of times, like my students will in early English or just sort of literature classes, they will, if we read Oedipus, they will impose this kind of internal morality or an internal conscience onto the character of Oedipus, like, oh, he should have known better than to sleep with his mother. Like they're always, the students are looking for some sort of internal reason, some sort of flaw that he, in judgment, that he necessarily made. But and we have, like in the ancient world, that we have a like terms like hamartia and hubris to talk about these flaws. But the emphasis of the tragedy is that there is no other way that this could have been. Whereas I feel like sometimes modern readers are looking like for that element, like, well, if he had made this other choice, something else would have happened. The point of the tragedy is that this is the way things go. There is no alternating the course of those particular those events. And again, think of that force of nature, right? Like, this is the way the world turns, and it's going to turn this way no matter what. Once we get to a modern thinker or a modern character like Hamlet, who's really trying to negotiate that kind of idea from a Christianized worldview, then we get a whole lot of complexity of interiority with modern literature that doesn't necessarily exist. And this is what in the ancient world, right? And this is what I think the story that Bakhtin is trying to tell us is how does literature develop in terms of genre, and it, in the novelistic genre at least, over a really broad swath of time. We're talking like 1,000 years here, right? So he's breaking down that story towards interiority. He says it's true. So the character begins to take on this kind of like purification ritual for guilt. The primary initiative, he says, therefore, belongs to the hero himself and not and to his personality. It's true that this initiative is not positive in a creative sense, but this is not very important here. He says what we have is guilt, moral weakness, error, and in its Christian hagiographic variant, sin, as initiating forces. The first image of the hero is characterized by the negative initiative: youthful, frivolous, restrained or unrestrained, a voluptuary, curious, in a careless way. He attracts the power of chance to himself. The initial link of the adventure is sequence in the indeterminate sequence is thus determined not by chance, but by the hero himself and by the nature of his personality. Maybe another way to sort of think about it is like to go back to the idea of Oedipus, right? Like Oedipus, even we're told that even the gods, like at times, like are sympathetic to Oedipus. Like he gets such, his fate is such a raw deal that there's sympathy that it evokes even in the gods, and so the gods in that particular sense can't even interfere to change the fates as well, right? But what emerges with this chronotope of Metamorphosis is increasingly a kind of disciplined self. So again, like we haven't talked a lot about Foucault in this series, but Michel Foucault has this famous book called Discipline and Punish, where he very much tracks a similar movement. The final link, says Bakhtin, the conclusion of the entire adventure sequence is likewise not determined by chance. Lucius is saved by the goddess Isis, who shows him what he must do to regain human form. The goddess Isis functions here not as a synonym for good fortune, as do the gods in the Greek romance, but as Lucius's patroness, directing him towards his purification, demanding from him highly detailed purifying rituals and ascesis. Characteristically, visions and dreams have a very different meaning in Apuleius from what they had in Greek romance. In the Greek romance, dreams and visions make men aware of the will of the gods or of chance. They could not be used as a means of avoiding the blows of fate or the taking measures against such a fate, but were granted rather that men may bear their sufferings more easily. So again, the gods don't change the fate, the gods might help a human bear it. And Apuleius, I skipped a sentence. Dreams and visions, therefore, do not incite the heroes to any activity. But in Apuleius, on the contrary, dreams and visions provide instructions to the heroes, telling them what to do, how to act in order to change their fate. That is, they force the heroes to take definite steps and to act. And so we're seeing almost this kind of didactic, this teaching element that becomes part of a relationship between here Apuleius and Isis, the goddess, right? And then later on, we're going to see Christianity sort of take that up in forms of the image of Christ, the imago, right? How do you bear your own cross in the world, right? Like as a kind of image of going through the trial or the ordeal that the savior figure goes through. In the ancient world, there's blind fate. The gods might feel sympathetic, they might help you out to endure it, but they don't change the fate itself, right? He says on page 118, here you have Lucius, after so many misfortunes sent you by fate, after having endured so many tempests, have you finally reached the peaceful haven, the altars of mercy. Neither your noble lineage, nor your position, nor learning itself, in which you so excelled, could avail you, but because you had become a slave of voluptuousness owing to the passion of your youthful years, you have received a fateful retribution for your prurient curiosity. But blind fate, tormenting you with the worst possible dangers, herself not knowing it, led you to your present blessedness. She must now go and rage somewhere else, for she must seek out another victim on whom to practice her cruelty. For among those who have dedicated their lives to our supreme goddess, there is no place for ruinous chance? How did subjecting you to thieves, to wild beasts, to slavery, to cruel choices at every turn, to a daily expectation of death benefit fate? For now, another fate has taken you under her protection, one not blind, but one who can see. Think about that language, one not blind, but one who can see. If you've ever tried to like look or translate the New Testament, for example, lots of that blindness versus seeing, like seeing the light, literally, that happens when this kind of like teaching didactic goddess of Isis, sort of this different relationship to a deity comes in. And with that, what we see is a more individualized, of course, sense of guilt. Yes, it's been delivered by blind fate, but within that, there's a sort of way, maybe not to completely counter fate, but to shift the trajectory, that within fate, there's also this opening possibility towards redemption, reformation. And I think if it sounds like very Christian to your ears, it's like, yes, like that's exactly what the Christians are doing. But I think what Bakhtin is getting at, and what we can just sort of see historically in Bakhtin, is that as a philosophical movement saturates the Mediterranean area well before what we know of today as Christianity sort of takes its particular form, through a kind of savior that resets temporality itself. Down at the bottom of page 118 in the text, thus we see that the adventure sequence, governed as it is by chance, is here utterly subordinated to another sequence that encompasses and interprets it: guilt, punishment, redemption, blessedness. This sequence is governed by a completely different logic, one that has nothing to do with the adventure logic. It is an active sequence determining as its first priority the very metamorphosis itself, that is, the shifting appearance of the hero. Thus, a frivolous and fecklessly curious Lucius becomes Lucius the ass, and after his suffering becomes Lucius the purified, the enlightened. In this sense, like, notice how it becomes temporalized in this linear sequential notion of time and temporality, right? That will be the time of the secular. Now, notice how the time of the secular here is completely bound up with the rehabilitation of the wayward individual, right? It's a disciplining way that temporality itself is structured and works, and that's how Christian time works as well. And even in the backdrop to our own particular culture, we tend to have these what becomes, I call it Euro-Christian, because it develops in Italy, right, with Rome. So like what we get in the West especially is that embedded in our sense of temporality is this kind of metaphysic that comes from a kind of Christian theology. Now, did it have pagan elements to begin with? Of course, yes, of course. We're seeing that in this particular moment here, but in the disciplining aspect of it, as that becomes the focal feature, and as the European novel develops, it ends up showing up in terms of its media form, right? The form of the media, right? Media just means like mediation, right? In the form of the book, in the beginning, middle, and sequentializing of the book, or the codex, which the Christians use as their form, we get this reiteration of the way that time and temporality works. And over years and centuries, and just over our individual lifetimes, we're habituated to thinking about the way that time works as well. And that's what makes many of us, at least in terms of worldview, at a very basic level, Euro-Christian, but maybe not Christians by faith, right? And that the fact that there are people in the world that are not that way. That like, and again, I bring up indigenous folks and indigenous worldview. A lot of times people who don't think of themselves as Christian or Euro-Christian think that they can understand maybe indigenous people, or they want to reject Christianity and embrace a kind of indigenous worldview, because they see it as a kind of way out or a kind of escape, or maybe perhaps they're romanticizing indigenous life, whatever that is. But the point that I'm making here is that the temporal structure and the way that it's embedded over time, over thousands of years in our media, comes to habituate us to particular notions of morality, time, how life works, what to expect in a lifetime. All of that stuff is showing up in our literature and in our stories. And this is how chronotopes come to work as well in Bakhtin's analysis. And so here we get the chronotope of the road, for example, showing up, which came up in an earlier lecture. The chronotope of the road, we can think of it in terms of what cognitive scientists now call an idealized cognitive model. So we think about life as a journey, right? The road of life, on the road of life, right? The chronotope comes as a particular way of structuring a linear temporal way towards existence. And so we think about like a really great director like David Lynch. If you've ever watched Twin Peaks, or throughout all of David Lynch's films, there is this recurring motif of a car driving on a winding road, and it's just driving towards nowhere, and it keeps coming in at various times, but there doesn't ever seem to be like a real destination, right? And I think that's a way that I think that's a director like David Lynch is using this kind of chronotope as part of his vocabulary in his own imaging in a really unique and creative way. Really different than Wim Wenders, who tries to make the ultimate road movie after he makes Wings of Desire is his big film, and then he goes on and he makes this flop of a movie, for, I think, for critics anyway, that really tries to address the idea of the road. And we of course have like the genre of the road movie as well. What an idealized cognitive model is it's like, now neuroscientists say that we build neural pathways from the time that we're little kids that shape our worldview, and it's physical. It's not a metaphor of like, I have my internal brain and it's a map of the world. No, the actual neurons passing through the channels are the actual map. That isn't a representation and represented problem. But what we get from that are images like an idealized cognitive model, which is that life works linear, sequentially, and that the metaphor of the road becomes one way of thinking about that. On page 120, Bakhtin says, the most characteristic thing about this novel is the way that it fuses the course of an individual's life at its major turning points with its actual spatial course of the road, that is, with wanderings. Thus is realized the metaphor, the path of life. The path itself extends through familiar native territory in which there is nothing exotic, alien, or strange. Thus, a unique novelistic chronotope is created, one that has played an enormous role in the history of the genre. At its heart is folklore. Various means for realizing the metaphor of the path of life play a large role in all aspects of folklore. One can even go as far as to say that in folklore, a road is almost never merely a road, but is always suggests the whole or an entire portion of a path of life. And think of like, if we're thinking about like in anthropological terms or archaeological, think of like some like Neolithic human walking around. We know that they have all of the same kind of apparatus of thought, like that we have. They're capable of the same complexity of thought. But the road, life as a path, life as a road doesn't even work, even if they're living a completely migratory existence, right? Because they don't have that shaped linear sort of sense of getting from one destination A to destination B, but that has become part of the way that we have been habituated to such an extent through the literature, through the stories, through the narratives that we tell ourselves over and over again, that we almost go directly to the metaphor itself from the image. And so from this, as it becomes more and more internalized, we get more of an emphasis on experience, right? The experience of the individual who is individuated, who is disciplined by their gods or goddesses. On 122, he says, playing the lowest role in the lowest level of society, Lucius does not participate internally in that life and is therefore in an even better position to observe it and to study all of its secrets. For him, this is the experience of studying and understanding human beings. I myself, says Lucius, remember my sojourn as an ass with great gratitude for having suffered the turns of fate under cover of this animal's skin. I have become, if not wiser, at least more experienced. And this is like, we take it all the way into like the New Age movement, right? I think the ways that we think about like how we could be better people or how we've transformed our self-knowledge as it exists for us as individuals, whether we're reading like a Brene Brown book, and or my girlfriend was telling me about a book the other day that based on the question, what happened to you, right? Our psychological development, our therapeutic society that we live in, that Michel Foucault in many ways so accurately discusses and talks about in various books of his on the disciplining of the self. Bakhtin was doing this already, and he's showing us how it comes from literature and from storytelling and from folklore itself, right? So it's a different side of the equation, but he's also responding to science, to space-time and ideas of Albert Einstein. As we get more of this emphasis on the individual and interiority, of course, it creates a dyad between the individual, the private self, and the public self or public life, which will become another important feature of Euro-Christian society, and even a little bit before that, Roman society as well. There's a book that recently came out, I'm looking at it over there, by David Graeber, called The Dawn of Everything, where they're very much questioning the ways that narratives of civilizational development have been recycled and reiterated over and over again in our scientific textbooks, from anthropology to our shows on the Discovery Channel about human evolution. And they're challenging that kind of master narrative as well in that particular book. I just wanted to mention it because I think that it's a good parallel to Bakhtin's book here. But again, Bakhtin, through his literary analysis, is giving us a lot of richness that we don't get in our self-help books, right? Like because he's willing to track this in such a longer temporal move, and so much deeper even than just thinking about the 19th century Bildungsroman, or thinking about Charles Dickens and Great Expectations, which is an amazing novel that tells the whole life of a character, right? He says that once we get this kind of literature of public and private, then we get all of this intrigue of spying and servants and eavesdropping, along with like that emphasis on guilt and transformation. And he talks about Dickens and Thackeray throughout here. Vanity Fair, the novel by Thackeray. He says, I note in the passing that in all the examples we've analyzed, the factor of metamorphosis is preserved to a certain extent in one form or another. The rogue's change of roles or masks, the transformation of the beggar into the rich man, the homeless tramp into the wealthy aristocrat, and the thief and pickpocket into the kind and repentant Christian, and so forth. And he shifts this again towards the end of this section towards an emphasis on everyday life. So what we're going to get is more nuance to how the development of the personal character happens. It maybe might not be one singular event, but lots of aggregate events over a person's life, as in the Bildungsroman novel. He says everyday life. In this everyday maelstrom of personal life, time is deprived of its unity and its wholeness. It's chopped up into separate segments, each encompassing a single episode from everyday life. The separate episodes, and this is especially true of inserted novellas dealing with everyday life, are rounded off and complete, but at the same time are isolated and self-sufficient. The everyday world is scattered, fragmented, deprived of essential connections. It is not permeated with a single temporal sequence, which has its own specific systematization and ineluctability. These temporal segments of episodes from everyday life are therefore arranged, as it were, perpendicular to the pivotal axis of the novel, which is the sequence of guilt, punishment, redemption, purification, and blessedness, precisely at the moment of punishment and redemption. And so then this shifts his discussion over to the novel Satyricon by Petronius, where it's going to be shown again, but of course we only get fragments in that particular novel. He says in hagiographic examples, or the lives of the saints, of the everyday type of adventure, the factor of metamorphosis is foregrounded: sinful life, crisis, redemption, sainthood. Think of the Confessions of Saint Augustine is probably a really great example. It's a autobiographical example, and so he's not treating it as he does the literature here, but we can see the literary influence of Saint Augustine's reading on his own articulation of his confessions of self and self-disciplining. The everyday plain adventure is given in the form of exposure a sinful life, or the repentant confession. These forms, and particularly the latter, already border on a third type of ancient novel, which he will call shift towards the ancient biography in part 3, but that will take us into another lecture. So thanks for listening, watching, support us on Patreon if you are so willing. We will see you again in another video lecture. Take care. Have a good day, morning, evening, whenever you are.